We need to take a minute. We need to talk about John Marshall, one of the most important people in American history, and I think for the common person, one of the most underrated, in terms of his importance anyway, Americans of all time. John Marshall, of course, was one of those midnight judges. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, appointed by John Adams as Adams was leaving office. And he was sort of a one-man constitutional convention. In fact, John Marshall might have done more to define what the Constitution meant than any other American, including people like Madison and Hamilton. He was a Federalist, which meant he tended to side with wealthy interest and business interest. One of the principles he established was that contracts are supreme. Contracts are the most important thing, more important in some ways than law, actually. In Fletcher v. Peck in 1810, this is a case where a number of people bribed Georgia government officials to get their hands on land the government was giving out. And people sued the government saying you should take that land away from those people because they got it through corruption and sell it fairly. But Marshall said, no, we have to honor contracts. If we don't honor contracts, if contracts can't be trusted, there can be no business growth in the United States. And he ruled that the crooked contracts had to be honored, even though they were done through corruption. In Dartmouth v. Woodward in 1819, Daniel Webster, who we'll be talking about as we go forward here, will argue for Dartmouth. Now, New Hampshire wants a state college. States are now beginning to create their own state colleges, like the University of North Carolina or whatever, Virginia, whatever. New Hampshire, instead of starting from scratch, wants to take Dartmouth, which is a private school, and simply turn it into a public college. Dartmouth argues that it has a charter to operate as a private school, and it would violate that charter to just simply rip Dartmouth away and turn it into a public school. Marshall says that the charter is a contract and therefore cannot be broken, even by the government. And this is actually the basis for corporations in America. The whole idea that you could create an entity through contract and the government cannot interfere in that contract. And so this Dartmouth v. Woodward decision is basically what the entire American economic system, for the most part, rests on today. In Cohens v. Virginia in 1821, he ruled that states gave up sovereignty by adopting the Constitution of the federal courts could overrule state courts. This is important because one of the great debates of the time was where did state power end and federal power begin? And John Marshall believed that federal power was dominant, that state power was relatively insignificant. And so here he rules that you can appeal a state court decision to the Supreme Court, meaning that the Supreme Court oversaw the state courts as well as the federal courts, which was a major expansion of federal power. It's interesting to point out that Rhode Island and North Carolina never agreed to the Constitution. So why did their courts have to fall under the Supreme Court when they had rejected the Constitution? But Marshall didn't worry about those kind of fine points. Similarly, we have McCulloch v. Maryland. This is an 1819 case where Maryland tries to put a tax on banks, including the Bank of the United States. Webster argues that a bank, first off, is constitutional under the Necessary and Proper Clause. Remember, Jefferson was appalled by the bank, but Hamilton said that the Constitution said he could do whatever is necessary and proper. And Webster also argued that the power to tax something is the power to destroy it, so the state government cannot tax the federal government, or that would give the state government the power to destroy the federal government. Marshall, of course, ruled in favor of the federal government and said that Maryland could not tax the Bank of the United States, establishing two things. One, the Necessary and Proper Clause was legitimate. It was justifiable. And two, that the federal government was dominant in any area that it was given power over. That if the Constitution gave the federal government power in an area, then the federal government had total power over the state government in that area. In Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, there's a ferry running across the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. There's actually two. One has been given a charter to operate by the federal government. The other has been given a charter to operate by the national government. Both are supposed to be monopolies, and so they sue each other over who can give the charter, the federal or the national government. Well, you should be able to guess by now how Marshall's going to go. But he says that the Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, gives the federal government supremacy over commerce between states, and since this ferry runs between two states, New York and New Jersey, the federal charter is dominant, and he invalidates the state charter, again establishing the dominance of the federal government over the state governments. Marshall creates ultimately two things a system where contracts can trump law in state and governments, and a system where the government is dominated at the federal level, and the states become secondary. Marshall also gives important rulings on the tribes. In Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823, a Native American tribe sells its land to this guy Johnson, but then also turns around and gives that same land to the United States in a treaty. Now the question here is, which takes precedence, the private contract with Johnson or the treaty with the federal government? So here we have an interesting case because it's the two things Marshall loves, private contracts but the power of the federal government. So who's he going to choose? He actually chooses the U.S. government. He says it's American land. And specifically what he says is that the Native Americans have the right to do whatever they want with their land, and they can't sell it to private individuals. He says only the American government can take or buy land from the Native Americans, not private citizens. And so he establishes the idea that the Native Americans are kind of their own independent nations, and so they have to treat with us as a nation, us being the United States government, not individuals. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, this is a little bit out of the time frame of this lecture. We'll talk more about this later, but Andrew Jackson is trying to force, the Georgia government actually is trying to force the Cherokee off of their land in Georgia. And so the Cherokee fight back by suing. And John Marshall says that the tribes are sovereign, meaning they have power over themselves, and Georgia has no right to take their land away. Again, establishing this idea of Native American sovereignty. Of course, Jackson ignores this and throws them off their land anyway, and we'll deal with that when we get to the age of Jackson. But understand the importance of John Marshall, establishing the dominance of the federal government and the supremacy of contracts as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Finally, we need to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. Latin America had become a series of major trading partners for the United States. We were doing lots of business and making a lot of money trading with Latin America. In 1815, we declared that we would be neutral in all wars for independence in Latin America. Not only do we have the Mexican Revolution in 1821, but we have a series of Central and South American and Caribbean wars for independence, and America stays out of them. We do sell ships and supplies to the revolutionaries, which is natural. Not only do we see them as potential business partners, we like the idea of getting the European nations out of our half of the world as we see it. And of course, we're sympathetic to them. We had won our own independence not too much earlier, right? We prefer Latin American independence, although we don't get directly involved. In 1822, we become the first, or among the first countries to recognize Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. Actually, we're the first country to recognize all of those nations. And in 1823, when France starts talking about helping Spain take Mexico back, John Quincy Adams will write something that comes to be called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, John Quincy Adams writes it because he's the Secretary of State, so he's the chief diplomat. It's called the Monroe Doctrine because Monroe was the president. It's extremely nationalist. What it says is that Europe is not allowed to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. We basically claim that this entire half of the world is under our protection, and Europe is not allowed to come over here. Now, at the time, we say that we're going to stay out of the Eastern Hemisphere, and the rest of the world has to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, basically extending our protection to the Caribbean, Central and South America. For the most part, it has worked in the sense that Europe is not, or the rest of the world has not interfered very much in the Western Hemisphere since the Monroe Doctrine. Now, in terms of us staying out of the Eastern Hemisphere, that hasn't worked out as well, right? You think of World War I and World War II and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan and so on and so forth. But it was originally designed to keep France out of Mexico and Britain out of Cuba. The Spanish Empire was teetering, and there were lots of people in Europe eyeing Spanish possessions to take them over. But the Monroe Doctrine was fairly irrelevant at the time, because we weren't that powerful. But it will become the backbone of our foreign policy many, many generations later. And still today we consider it to be in effect, and it still occasionally gets invoked if Europe talks about getting involved in this half of the world.